Okay, so thank you everyone for coming today. Today we're having a talk by Fabrizio Gallai, who is a research fellow at UNIST, that's the University of the International Studies of Rome in Italy. Fabrizio's research is conducted using the framework Relevance theory and interactional sociolinguistics. And he has a particular interest in legal and humanitarian interpreting and the interpreter's treatment of non-truth conditional elements of speech. Fabrizio's work is cutting edge and offers a new perspective. For example, his PhD, supervised by Professor Diane Blakemore, offers a relevant theory account of interpreters' role, and he looked at the real data. It's a Greater Manchester Police interview data, which no one had ever had hands on. So I don't know why he managed to get hold of such data, but he used both theory and empirical data and presented a theoretically solid and empirically supported analysis. With this work, he demonstrated that interpreters are actually not that invisible, but they can be invisible if they want, and he will explain how. And this analysis defies the commonly accepted notion of translator invisibility within translation studies. Fabrizio's current research focuses on the ethical standards and the interface between relevance theory and interpreting and translation studies. And his new book will be published later this year, which we are very much excited about. So Fabrizio, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ryoko, and welcome everyone. I don't know whether you can see the screen with my PowerPoint presentation because it just switched off on its own before. So can you all see it?
Yes, we can.
Yes, that's good. So you can see my name and you can see the logo from the university. Good. So again, thank you, Ryoko, for the kind words. That's me. My name is Fabrizio Gallai, and today we'll be focusing on the intersection, on the interplay between relevance theory and translation and interpreting studies. I know that some of you are very well versed in translation and interpreting studies, but some of you might not. But I take it that all of us know the basics, the basic tenets of relevance theory. So I'm not going to go over the key notions of relevance theory, but I will touch upon some basic notions in translation and interpreting studies. So we start off with an intro, then I move on to tackle the interface between relevance theory and translation studies, then relevance theory and interpreting studies. These 2 points are my major points today. Unfortunately, I can't go into further detail on either, so I will just focus on these 2 major points. The fourth and the fifth we'll just touch upon, that is theoretical implications of practical applications, and last but not least, some concluding remarks on future avenues. There's a reference list at the bottom of my PowerPoint presentation, which will be shared, I hope, by Ryoko Kate. So obviously it's just a short list, we'll see, but you can get more from my book. As Ryoko was saying, we'll be talking about interpreting and translation, and the key question here in our world, in the world of interpreting and translation studies, is how do you define quality and competence of an interpreter or a translator? And how do you actually define translation and interpreting at all? How do they work? Well, in the last 3 decades, scholars have focused both on the product of these processes, but also on the cognitive aspects of these processes. And here comes relevance theory. Relevance theory is, as of today, the only theoretical framework in the area of cognitive pragmatics that has been adopted to capture the complexity of this type of communication. And that's why it's so important. It has received increasing popularity within my world, translation and interpreting, and because it tackles both linguistic and cognitive abilities, which are obviously involved in the process of translation and interpreting. So it's an appropriate framework for capturing the communicative acts, which we call translation and interpreting. However, this theory, relevance theory, has been sometimes has been misapplied in translation and interpreting. It's been presented as a training method. Sometimes the analysis fails to consider the special situation or mediated events. And so I decided, as Ryoko mentioned before, to publish a volume with Taylor and Francis on the intersection between relevance theory and translation and interpreting studies. It is the first attempt since Gut's work, whom I'm not sure whether is here today or not, because I can't see the participants anymore, but he said he would, and if he is, then I'm honored. It is the first attempt in 20 years to illustrate the explanatory potential of this theory in translation and interpreting studies, of getting closer to the communicator's intentions. And my volume will include some insights into Grecian theory and pragmatics and relevance theoretic pragmatics, but also loads of examples. So hopefully it will become a manual, a handy manual for both students of translation and interpreting, but also pragmatists who want to dwell on the issue of interpreting and translation. Just a little note here, I will be using uppercase for interpretation in terms of meta-representation of communicators' thoughts, whereas lowercase interpreting or interpretation will be used to indicate the activity of conference or dialogue interpreters. Just a little note here. So I'll give you a little bit of the background on the interface between pragmatics and translation interpreting studies. So we start off from the 1970s. Interpreting and translation start becoming an independent discipline. And scholars started realizing that we need to focus both on the process and the product of this activity. And so they all started recognizing the key function of language as a bearer of meaning in mediated communication. So T&I scholars started using linguistics, in particular systemic functional linguistics, structural linguistics, and pragmatics. And pragmatics was started being used in the 1970s, and under a lot of different, in a lot of different theoretical frameworks. In particular, speech acts, Grice was used, politeness theory, and relevance theory, obviously, starting from the 1990s. Now, the key issue here is with the definition of context. As you can imagine, all communicative acts have both an external and an internal dimension of communication. So that happens with translation and interpreting acts as well. So scholars kind of split between these two contexts. On one side, you had academics who focused on the external or situational context, so the wider cultural context in which the activity is embedded. And on the other, you had scholars in translation and interpreting studies focusing on internal cognitive factors. In particular, there was a paradigm, a theoretical trend that started emerging, which was called Cognitive Translation Interpreting Studies Paradigm, or CTIS as an acronym. So CTIS, and in particular, relevance theory and cognitive pragmatics in general, have now become an established area within translation interpreting studies. So, as I said, we start off by focusing on translation studies. Professor Gut, whom I'm not sure whether he's there or not. Professor Gut, are you there? Perhaps not. So, yes, Professor Gut.
Yes, he's there. He's there.
He is. Well, I'm honored because it all started with him and his work in 1991. This was the first book, a very seminal work on the interface between translation studies and relevance theory. His book is called Translation and Relevance, Cognition and Context. He had a second edition in 2000, this is seminal work. This is at the basis of everything we do as researchers in relevance theory informed translation interpreting studies. So I will dwell on Professor Gut's work more than anything, because I think it helps people who are not familiar with this field of study understand where this research is going. So firstly we'll look at how Professor Gut defined translation and how he and other users, other scholars described translator decision-making processes. And then we'll see how his theory, his model, has been applied to analyze different translation-related issues in different contexts. In particular, we also have interdisciplinary methods of analysis. Unfortunately, as I say on the slide, I only be able to give you one example out of all these approaches based on Gut's work, but there are many. So Gut's approach to translation, as I said, is at the basis of our field of research. And according to Gut, translation falls within the domain of communication. It's a form of communication just like anything else. And the translator mediates between the intentions and evidences of the source text and the target text, which is an ostensive stimulus defined as a case of interlingual interpretive use. So now, if you're familiar with relevance theory, then you're also familiar with the concept of interpretive use or attributive use. So that's what Gut used originally to describe translation. So translators achieve relevance by communicating the source communicator's intentions to the target audience. And he says that the study of the process of translation should focus on the comparison of interpretations, not on the reproduction of words, linguistic constructions, or textual features. So as you can see, as you could expect, if you know relevance theory, the shift is now on cognitive processes, in particular on the interpretations. Good. So translation is an ostensive stimulus. So you can have ostensive communication by translation, and this depends on the interplay between the psychological context, which he called cognitive environment of an utterance, and the processing effort required to derive contextual effects. Obviously, you can see here the influence of Sperber-Wilson's work. So this communication involves establishing a chain of resemblance relations between a set of interpretations of the source text. It starts with the intended interpretation of the source text and ends with the assessment of the evidence for the interpretation arrived at by the target text reader. So in order to ensure interpretive resemblance, translators must make use of metacognitive activities through monitoring processes. So there's a lot of metacognitive activity involved in the creation of a translation. And this is what Gut proposed as the interpretive use of translations, interpretive use of language. So we start off from the propositional form of the text, which is an interpretation of a thought of the translator and also interpreter, because he associates translation with simultaneous interpreting as well. This in itself, in turn, it is an interpretation of a thought attributed to the original speaker. So again, if you're familiar with the concept of interpretive use of language from relevance theory, you'll recognize this, this schema. So the translator's task, according to Gut's work, is to achieve optimal relevance. In his works, the translator's task is to understand at each point what contextual effects were referred in the original context and thereby form a comprehensive hypothesis of the intended interpretation of the original, consisting of both explicatures and implicatures. According to Gut, and this has proved right, relevance theory can be applied to many types of translation, from poetry, so literature, to simultaneous interpreting, as I said before. He makes an important distinction, which was picked up by many scholars after him. In 1989, he distinguishes between indirect and direct translation. Now, this depends on the degree of interpretive resemblance between utterances. The direct translation allows for complete interpretive resemblance. So the source language audience must share the same context in which the author originally encoded the source text, and the translation will then allow the target audience to draw similar, I'm not saying the same here, similar inferences as those expected for the source text audience. So guided, obviously, all this by the two principles of relevance. An indirect translation, on the other hand, occurs when only a subset of the source text, text context is represented or recoverable in the target text context. Now, the exact definition that was given by Gut in 1991 is as such. A direct translation is a receptor language utterance. A language utterance, or is a direct translation of a source language utterance, if and only if it purports to interpretively resemble the original completely in the context envisaged for the original. Again, I'm saying here it purports because Gut doesn't believe that the resemblance will be complete, will be total, but this is obviously striving for. So it's an attempt at. Just bear in mind that according to the author, there is no clear boundary between these two modes, between direct and indirect translation. So while direct translation strives for complete interpretive resemblance, strives for it, indirect translation settles for interpretive resemblance in relevant respects. So on one side, you have a strive for complete resemblance, on the other, just a strive for resemblance in some respects. So thereby follows the definition of faithfulness, which, if you're familiar with this field of research, is central to all research on translation and interpreting. Faithfulness is taken from Spurgeon Wilson's definition of faithfulness, and it's a matter of yielding the intended interpretation of the source text through adequate contextual effects that avoid unnecessary processing effort. So the degree to which the interpretation resembles the source text and the means of expressing that interpretation are determined by their relevance in the receiving situation. So faithfulness is mainly to do with degree. So is a matter of degree. Now, another very important concept by Gut, advocated by Gut, is the definition of shared communicative clues. And now he says that a direct translation, such as we defined it now, can be defined only in terms of the use of communicative clues, which allow for explicit treatment of many issues. Examples of these clues are various. They're listed at the bottom of my slide. There can be semantic representations, there can be phonetic properties, there can be discourse markers, so procedural meaning. There can be formulaic expressions, etc., etc. These clues are important just as they are important in a monolingual context, because they enable inferential processing. So translators are required to provide these clues arising from a variety of properties. Good translation should, at least. Obviously, the big difference between a monolingual context and a bilingual context is that languages differ both in the patterns of structure employed and in the values assigned to what could be a similar pattern. So translators must consider the frequency of use of these clues in the target language. I'm just going to give you a small example here. Focalization in English, it has a stress on a common as a common realization, so it requires minimal processing effort on an English speaker's part. But if I take an alternative version, for instance, of clefting in a target language, Japanese, this would only be adequate if clefting is also commonly used in this language as a clue. So otherwise, imbalance would set in, and the interlingual disparity between cost and benefit would become too much to handle for the reader of the target text. Gut also talks about assessing communicability. A translator's task, we said, is to form a communicative intention based on the principle of relevance, and then decide whether this communicative intention can in fact be communicated. This is really important. So again, I quote from Gut, I hope he doesn't mind. The translator is confronted not only with the question of how he should communicate, but what he can reasonably expect to convey by means of his translation. The answer will be determined by his view of the cognitive environment of the target audience, and it will affect some basic decisions. It will, for example, have a bearing on whether he should engage in interpretive use at all, or whether descriptive use, non-translation, would be more appropriate. So he gives an example from the Bible. The Bible translated for people of Ethiopia, a community called Silti, and they live on Ethiopia's highlands. And so most of them, the majority of them, might not be familiar with Gallai or the Sea of Galilee or fishing, all concepts relevant for Bible readers. So what happens there? Well, if these readers cannot make sense of this ideas at all, there's a problem. Obviously, the translation, if we just refer, we render this word Sea of Galilee just like that, or fishing just like that, the relevance produced by this target text might be very low. So what can translators do? Well, there's two different options there for translators. The first one is to go for high interpretive resemblance with the source text. So it's when you expect the target text readers to adjust their cognitive environment in ways that are required for effective interpretation. The other options for translators is to take the cognitive environment of the target text readers as given and adapt the intended target text meaning to it, resulting in adequate contextual effects that in that environment at the cost of a reduced degree of interpretive resemblance. So the end result will be a reduced degree of interpretive resemblance. Again, we talk about degree of resemblance here, degree of faithfulness, as I mentioned before. One last very important concept from Good's work, out of many, is the focus on translators' competence. He talks about a high level of meta-representational skills that are required to manage different interpretations in cognitive environments. And so he says that he defends the idea of a competence-oriented research of translation, in short, CORT, whose aim would be to seek to understand translation through understanding the communicative competence that makes it possible for both the translator and his or her audience. This concept of translator's competence will have much success within my world. But the legacy of Good's approach is not limited to that. Over the past 3 decades, from 1991, this approach has been integrated into experimental translation process research of any kind. Obviously, I have no time to go into any detail. I will in the book, but not here. It's been validated empirically in many, many ways in different fields of study, such as you can see, literature, ads. Ryoko, who's here, has written about figurative language in ads in 2019. Then you have some work on irony, jokes, and wordplay, audiovisual translation. You have some interdisciplinary methods of analysis in audiovisual translation, in employing brain imaging methods, in post-editing machine translation, and on over a wide array of notions by Good. So the effort-effect relation, pragmatic competence, procedural meaning, explicitation. So a lot of scholars have drawn on Good to both as a single approach or a mixed method approach to study a wide variety of phenomena in translation studies. Now, I don't think I have time to go through the example that I wanted to give you. Unfortunately, it was from Alvis and et al. 2019, and it was an experimental paradigm on using brain scans. But no, I don't have time to go through it. I will move on to my third point because I don't want to waste too much time, unfortunately. My third point is interpreting the interface between interpreting studies and relevance theory. Now, what was said about translation studies, that is the influence from Good's work, is also true here. But it's also true for interpreting studies that this process has been seen both as a cognitive process as much as a linguistic and social process. So we have both social or relational models, especially influencing dialogue interpreting, and cognitive process models, especially influencing conference interpreting studies. Within the cognitive process models, obviously, you also have the CTIS models, including cognitive pragmatics. Now, more so than in translation studies, this is not a watertight distinction. There's a lot of interdisciplinarity going on in interpreting studies, perhaps even more so than in translation studies. And so relevance theory has been mostly used methodologically in combination with other models, especially sociolinguistic models. This is to do perhaps with the difference between the process of translation and interpreting, which is touched upon by Seton and Dorrant in 2016. On one side, translation. In translation, the intensity of expanded cognitive effort is relatively low most of the time. And the feeling of discomfort associated with effort mostly only arises if it's prolonged. In interpreting, instead, the intensity can be very high, especially when the speaker is fast, just like I'm being fast now, I'm sorry, and when they speak with an accent, just like me. So, so high intensity in my speech. Or when the speech is informally dense. And this happens all the time in interpreting, as you can imagine, both in the dialogue setting and in the conference setting. The other difference is to do with the definition of inferencing in interpreting studies. So interpreting is accounted for in terms of Gutt's model, as we said, but inferencing here, inference for translators and interpreters differs mainly in terms of processing constraints, speed, as I said before, and the contexts used, which you can imagine are very different. In interpreting, contextual knowledge is drawn more from direct visual perception, just like you are being exposed to me at the moment, or temporal co-presence, especially in dialogue interpreting, and much more than in translation, as translators generally rely on written documents, as you know. So given that linguistic ambiguity may force a choice of output when no equivalent ambiguous word exists in the target language, interpreting provides particularly clear evidence of the need for inferencing in utterance comprehension. It's a very good field of study for pragmaticists. Relevance theory informed interpreting studies models are split into three kinds. The first kind is conference interpreting studies in the simultaneous mode. The second one is conference interpreting consecutive mode, and the third one is dialogue interpreting, so public service interpreting, mainly in the legal sector here. So most dialogue interpreting studies which have been influenced by relevance theory over the years are set in the legal sector. I've given you a list of just a short list of names of authors who've dealt with these issues under a relevance theoretic perspective. I have time to just touch upon two studies very quickly that have Seton and my study. Seton, whom I'm not sure whether he's here as well. Professor Seton, you there? I feel ashamed. Perhaps not. He said he was going to be here, but perhaps didn't make it. So, Professor Seton,
he's here. He's here.
I'm here.
Is-
Sorry, I'm not very good at Zoom. I forgot
Right.
to press the right buttons. Hi.
I'm ashamed twice. So Professor Sutton's work is also seminal in our field, and it goes back to his first study in 1998, and then reproposed in his book in 1999, where he worked on simultaneous interpreting. So he also co-wrote 2 manuals on interpreting, simultaneous interpreting, which espouse the relevance theoretic oriented model. Now, Professor Sutton's main work draws on Gutt's model and Gutt's idea of optimal interpretive relevance and resemblance, and so he applies these ideas to simultaneous interpreting and the principles of relevance, the concept of optimal interpretive resemblance, all apply particularly well to simultaneous interpreting, as we said before, for the reasons that we mentioned before. He mentions the interpreter's goal as, and I quote here from Sutton Law in 2016, make accessible to the interpreter's audience the cognitive effects intended by the speaker as she understands them at reasonable processing cost and risk, using whatever communicative devices available in the output language are appropriate and effective to do so in her projection of the listener's available contexts. So we, as I said before, we are applying Gutt's definition of interpretive resemblance to the world of simultaneous interpreting. Quality, again, is defined by the measure of relevance. In particular, is defined as fidelity plus relevance. So relevance will depend on the speaker's expressive ability, the listener's comprehension, their accessible contexts, through knowledge, preparation, and presence, and their motivation to communicate. In choosing a particular rendition of the source language ostensive stimulus, interpreters must anticipate differences between their own and the target language addressee's cognitive environment. This term, cognitive environment, comes back to haunt us from Gutt's work, if you remember. He, in particular, in his work, in his 1999 work, he comes up with a mental model for simultaneous interpreting. And unfortunately, again, I don't have time to go through this. Ryoko, how much time do I have left? I don't think I have much time left.
Well, we have 22 minutes left altogether, including discussion.
Yeah.
So
I want to be able to finish about 5 minutes so that we can sparkle a little debate. What do you think? I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
So I'll just make it brief. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into much detail about Professor Sutton's mental model. I'm sorry. But as I say on this slide, it aims at a detailed breakdown of psycholinguistic operations which are involved in simultaneous interpreting. He works on the Chinese English and German English combinations. And he particularly focuses on the concept of pragmatic clues to inference. He says that interpreting is a process in which linguistic decoding constantly interacts with inference from multiple inputs, including previous knowledge and rich pragmatic clues to inference. This concept of clues, as you recall, was mentioned in a slightly different way, but similarly in Gutt's model from before. This is the model. Again, I wish I had time to go into more detail, but I don't. And I'll just skip myself completely. So my work is on police interpreting, so a form of dialogue interpreting. and I have published 3 articles so far. I propose a mixed method approach with Goffman's sociolinguistics and relevance theory to reassess goods definition in terms of the Blakemore's thoughts on free indirect style. If you're interested, obviously I can provide you with further details at a later stage. We're just gonna go all the way through to point number 4. Very briefly, we've talked about relevance theory and interpreting translation studies. In my book, I will mention a couple of theoretical implications and practical applications of this interface. On one side, the methodological issues related to the development of an RT-inspired theoretical framework in translation interpreting, and on the other side, the practical applications to current training and practice. So on one side, I'll look at a quest for a unified account of translation interpreting, promoting interdisciplinary perspectives. I'll also say in my volume that I believe this work, relevance theoretic work on translation interpreting studies, can represent a massive contribution to pragmatic research as such, in particular to the field of experimental pragmatics, which we know is all the rage at the moment in relevance theory too. And I'll, in my book, I'll give some applications. I'll talk about some applications to current training and practice. In particular, I'll ask myself how to develop a meta and cross-pragmatic competence, which is of the essence for translators and interpreters. And I'll also talk about applications in terms of the main topics for training and practice under the relevance theoretic lens, that is the importance of cognitive load, cognitive efficiency, quality, fidelity, implicit and explicit competence, procedural elements, and ethical implications too, in terms of empowerment and empathy. So I'm sorry I've rushed it a bit at the end, but my concluding remarks are as such. This is one of the most challenging issues in all human communication. And in particular, T&I are a hard profession to put in practice. So they are highly interesting in terms of hidden indirect meaning in mediated utterances. Relevance theory is perfect to be applied, and it's equally adaptable in all fields of translation and interpreting, as we've seen. Methodologically speaking, scholars have mainly relied on Good's seminal work that I've talked about. They have shed light on a plethora of phenomena, really. And they mostly tend to adopt an interdisciplinary, descriptive, qualitative method of inquiry. There's a slight difference between translation and interpreting that I've mentioned before. So unlike translation studies, approaches to interpreting here have mainly focused on the product rather than the process. I hope that my volume, but also obviously you, will continue working on relevance theory-based research in translation interpreting studies. We have far from exhausted this field of inquiry, especially given its interdisciplinary outlook. Yet we all know that no single model, however complex and however elaborate, could hope to be validated as an account for a phenomenon as complex as translation or interpreting. So my question to you is, can one type of framework on its own form the basis for this phenomenon? And is it indeed possible to develop a unitary interdisciplinary framework, perhaps, which encompasses both the cognitive and the social dimensions of communication? Many scholars before in my world, including Gallai, have pointed towards an all-around account of translation interpreting, yet the integration of cognitive pragmatics and social and intercultural studies still awaits large-scale investigation. So it's up to me and up to you to investigate further. And with this, I'm just gonna leave you with this way too short reference list for translation studies and interpreting studies, and thank you for your attention. And please ask as many questions and, you know, put forward as many doubts as you can. Thank you.
Thanks, Fabrizio. It was very, very interesting. Maybe while we are waiting for people to come up with questions or formulating their questions into sentences, translating their thought into utterances, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your own work and how that contributes to translation and interpreting studies and to relevance theory as well, maybe in 2 minutes or so.
Okay, hold on. Shall I just share the screen again? Can you see?
Yeah, we can.
Good. So if I go like this, well, just very quickly, as I was saying, I was working on police interpersonal use, you mentioned as well in the introduction, and I have worked on real life data, which is very exciting. They were interviews, mediated interviews with Portuguese English and Italian English as combination, language combinations, with both suspects and a vulnerable victim. I've used a mixed method approach. It was Goffman, so a sociolinguistic approach, interactional sociolinguistics with relevance theory. And that obviously is the reason why I asked you to, if it's possible to put these two together, because some people have. Can you see the slides?
Yep.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, we can.
So my work brought me to reassess goods definition in a particular instance. And the particular instance is when interpreters add their own procedural elements. So overall, in police interpreting, I've noticed, and I'm not the only one, that interpreters completely ignore any kind of a discourse marker, and to be honest, most procedural elements of speech. But in particular, discourse markers, they're not seen as the meat and potato of the interaction. So they just leave it out. But I've also noticed that sometimes they add their own discourse markers. On one side, you have what I call non-speaker oriented additions, that is, cases in which the interpreter's rendition includes discourse markers not found in the original, but which are obviously attributed to the interpreter. So, you know, I'm talking, I'm the interpreter, so I'm saying this and this is my discourse marker, it's obvious. Some other additions, though, are speaker-oriented. So these are cases in which the interpreter's rendition includes a discourse marker not found in the original, but which is nevertheless understood by the hearer as being attributed to the original speaker. And to me, this allowed the interpreter to ascribe to the hearer the responsibility for what they say. So in this way, basically, we create a sense of intimacy between the hearer and the source text speaker, in this particular case, the interviewee or the police interviewer. And when speaker-oriented elements as such are added, optimal relevance is seen to be achieved not by increasing the mutuality between the interpreter and his audience, but by creating a sense of intimacy and mutuality between the source text communicator and his audience. And so it's justified by the way in which they contribute to the impression of a more direct line between the officer and the interviewee's thoughts. Obviously, this is just an impression. I'm not saying that the interpreter hasn't added, so they haven't intervened. They do intervene, and this is their own making, but the effect on the communication is different from non-speaker oriented procedural elements. So this is just a little summary of my work.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question.
I think earlier someone had a hands up.
Sorry, I had my hand up, but I was going to be asking exactly the same thing, because I was interested to know what additional thing is brought in when you're doing when you're doing and interpreting on behalf of somebody else, when the police person is present and the interviewee is present. And in a way, I guess, would it be true to say that the interviewer, I mean, you have to, if you've incorrectly or mistranslated or added a discourse marker that wasn't really intended, and so the interviewee takes away some message that wasn't intended, then the interviewer might pick up on that. So you've got another check against you.
No, they can't pick up on it because they don't have access to the original speaker, to the source text. So
right, but
the interpreter has a huge responsibility here, as you can imagine, especially in public service interpreting.
Right.
Additions have a huge effect on the bad ones. So the speaker-oriented additions, the non-speaker-oriented additions have a huge negative impact on interpreting techniques in particular. The interpreter has a very bad influence over those techniques. As I'm sure you're aware, police interviews are not just randomly conducted. They follow a certain pattern based on psychological studies, etc., of memory retrieval. There's different phases. And the main manual is called Enhanced Cognitive Interviewing Technique. And the interpreters don't know much about that technique that's used widely in the UK and all over the world. And so they have this huge impact on interviewing techniques, and obviously in the end on the interview overall. But this special case of speaker-oriented additions actually doesn't have that bad an influence, because, as I was saying, these are cases in which the rendition includes a procedural element, but it's nevertheless understood as being attributed to the police interviewer, for instance. So it creates this sense of mutuality between the interviewer and the interviewee. I hope that's clear enough.
And I think we have hands up from Lenny.
Yeah, hi, I'm sorry, I'm a party crasher. I got this link from my professor, and I'm really interested in this topic because I'm also working on a thesis about PSIT, and I happen to be an interpreter myself, and I was just curious about the discourse markers you mentioned, because I noticed that when I interpret for the police and they take notes or they write down the record of what has been talked about, they always polish the information, and actually discourse markers completely disappear from the record. And I wanted to, I was just curious what your experience has been.
This is one of my never-ending battles. When I was in the UK, I tried to vouch for all transcriptions of the interviews in both languages, because obviously, as you can imagine, it's not just discourse markers, which I'm very interested in because I love procedural meaning, but it's other things as well. So long as we don't have an official transcription of the interviews in bilingual mode, I don't think we have justice, to be fair. And as you're saying, it's not just course markers here. That when they take their report, when they write down their report, they just completely miss out on a lot of elements, verbal and non-verbal elements. They can be procedural, they can be conceptual, but they do miss out on a lot of them. They recreate a narration, they recreate a story that's more linear to be presented to the judges, obviously. But to me, that's fair enough. That happens in a monolingual context as well. But so police reports are obviously a good tool for justice, but in a bilingual context, in a mediated encounter, I believe there should be transcription. That's my thought, and not just mine, obviously.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Because if not, can I ask you a couple of questions? Like, this is kind of luxury. We've got Professor Good and Professor
Okay, I'm ashamed.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I say hi, but also I'm ashamed.
No, you should. But when you mentioned like degree of interpretive resemblance, and what came into my mind is sort of that sounded very much like Venuti's foreignization, domestication idea. Am I kind of right in thinking that it might be referring to some similar sort of phenomena, but from looking from the cognitive perspective, we won't be sort of coming up with sort of arbitrary labels such as that. So we're therefore working as degree of interpretive resemblance would have better explanatory force, if you will.
It does, to me, obviously, and I'm sure to you too, because it comes from a much broader theoretical framework, if you know what I mean. So when you see faithfulness in terms of degree regulated by relevance, I believe it's a much fairer vision of equivalence between two texts. But obviously, in inverted commas, you have to believe relevance theory and the concept of relevance, the two principles of relevance. But if you believe in the theory, then you embrace this idea that faithfulness is a matter of yielding the intended interpretation of the source text through adequate contextual effects that avoid unnecessary processing effort. So if you believe that human communication is regulated by the first principle of relevance in this case, then the faithfulness translation becomes just another act of communication, and faithfulness is also governed by this principle.
Okay.
So it's a very different starting point from many which of equivalence that we've seen before, which were much more text-based. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's much more, as I said before, I think I said it's not to do with the comparison. Well, Good said it's not to do with the comparison of two texts.
Yeah. Thank you. And sorry, can I ask one more question, maybe one more comment? The question is a discourse marker added by interpreters. Did you find out if interpreters were aware that they were adding these discourse markers themselves, or they just happened to do it?
No, these were video taped interviews from the past. And although the interpreters were still registered in the National Register of Public Service Interpreters in the UK when I was analysing the data, I could not contact them for ethical reasons. So I never had the chance to talk to them directly. Obviously, this is a big issue in terms of the application relevance theory to the translation interpreting work, is how much can you say it's been inferred? Especially when it comes to translation, because you don't have a direct contact with a reader. You might have, if you're lucky, in terms of observational study, but usually you don't. In interpreting, however, we can base our analysis on the evidence of what comes after, if you see what I mean. Obviously, we'll never know what goes on in people's heads. We're no mind readers, but you can see in an interpreted event, you can see the next turn, or the reaction from the hearer. So you have that kind of evidence there, which you could use as a basis to know what kind of inferences have been made.
Yeah, I just found it really interesting. What I was thinking was, if they were actually doing it like knowingly, that actually has implication for code of conduct as well, but also some similarity to some other type of translation. Say, fan translators often leave their marks on what they do.
I think it's to do with the fact that most translators, if they're chosen this path, this profession, they are highly aware of their linguistic skills in general, including pragmatic skills. They might not have the technical tools to describe them, but they know what works in a certain context, if you know what I mean. So instinctively, unconsciously, these interpreters in my data knew that a discourse marker there was working as a procedural element, so guiding an inferential process, as you know. But that's just based on instincts and unconscious decisions. I want training to bring this up to the level of consciousness, I hope.
Okay. There's a question from May in chat. Did you see this addition of this discourse markers by interpreters in any other setting than police investigations, like political context, for example, with other language pairs?
Yes, there's a plethora of evidence. Obviously, they haven't used my methods, analytical methods, but well, some of them have actually. A scholar whose name I can't remember now, but will be mentioned in my volume, he worked on discourse markers in European Parliament speeches. And he found a lot of additions from the interpreter's part. Also, the addition of discourse markers has been studied by Berg-Seligson in courtroom interpreting, in particular. So she was one of the most famous scholars who worked on that, and Hale as well, coming from speech act and politeness theory, but they analyzed the addition of discourse markers too. So Hale, H-A-L-E, Berg-Seligson for courtroom interpreting, and European Parliament speeches in relevance theory perspective, whose name I cannot remember, but will be in my volume, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments? We're coming to the, yes, we've actually gone past the time really.
Sorry.
No, I was asking too many questions. I'm the chair, I should be looking at watch, so sorry about that. Okay, so thank you very much for your very interesting talk and for coming, for others to coming today. And next month, we will have Angelica Anderson presenting on her master's thesis, starting on PhD. So it's going to be a basis of the PhD, which we are really excited about. So thanks again for coming today, and thanks for Fabrizio. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
So see you next month.
See you next month.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.